Hello and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with Nurole, the business-oriented podcast that brings the boardroom to your channel of choice. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Nurole, the board-level hiring platform that specializes in the high-value chair, independent director, advisory board member, and trustee placements that drive high-impact boards. Today, we'll be speaking with Mary Curnock Cook CBE. From 2010 to 2017, Mary was Chief Executive of UCAS, the Universities and Colleges Admissions Service. Earlier in her career, she held executive and non-executive positions in the education, hospitality, food, and biotech sectors. Mary is the chair of the Dyson Institute and of Pearson Education. She's also a non-executive director for the London Interdisciplinary School, the first new university since 1969 to offer full degree awarding powers in the UK from inception. The Student Room, which provides a safe online community for students across the UK. The Student Loan Company and Education Cubed, and is a trustee of the Higher Education Policy Institute. She also chairs an HE EdTech group on behalf of Emerge Education. Mary has a Masters of Science from London Business School, and she was awarded an OBE in 2000 and CBE in 2020. She's an honorary fellow of Birkbeck College and Goldsmiths, and has an honorary doctorate from the University of Gloucestershire. Mary earned her CBE for her many contributions to the education sector and is a contributing author to The Social CEO, a book that highlights the importance of social media in driving commercial success for business leaders in the digital age. Mary, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning.
I'd like to start with your journey into the boardroom, and curious to hear how you think about the golden threads that got you to where you are today. And it struck me while researching this that there's a wonderful irony in your story, which is that you left school at 16, which I imagine has played a big role in where you have focused your efforts.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, for most of my 20s and 30s, I hated not being a graduate. And I did finally go to university in my early 40s, by the way. But in the meantime, I just kind of got on with working life. And I actually got my first directorship when I was 23. I was so proud of this that I immediately went out and joined the Institute of Directors. And I've been a member, indeed, I'm a long-standing fellow there ever since. But from that age onwards, I never had a job where I wasn't either on the board of the organisation that I was working for or that I was attending and playing a key role in board meetings. Then I got my first chief exec job when I was 34. So I've also had quite a long period to watch more and less effective chairs in operation. And from, let me just think, when maybe late 30s, I started serving in non-exec roles alongside my executive jobs. So you could say that I had a pretty long apprenticeship before now, which is a kind of full-time non-exec portfolio.
Fantastic. What an amazing story. You, having served as a chief exec, what is there that you see now on the other side of the table where you think you would have done things differently as a chief exec?
Well, I'm going to be characteristically immodest here and say that I wish I had some chief execs who were as assiduous as I was in managing my relationship with my chairs over the years. Actually, when I did finally go to university, it was London Business School, and I did a master's there. And my dissertation was the transition period for new chief executives for kind of not-for-profit and charities and public sector organizations. And one of my key findings there was about the relationship between chairs and chief executives. So I was kind of very keenly aware of that, both from personal experience and from the research that I did for my master's. That said, I've chaired a couple of novice chief executives, and, it's definitely part of the chair's role to help the chief executive get it right, both for them and for their chair. But I've also been involved with some chief execs, both as chair and as an observing non-exec, where I think they could have been a bit more accepting of the guidance.
Talk me through that in more detail. How did you think about it as a chief exec, and what were the things that really jumped out from your research?
So in pretty much all of those roles, my sort of private sector boards have come, now that I'm doing a non-exec portfolio. But during my working life, most of those boards were charitable, third sector, public sector type roles. And I think almost invariably, the boards were volunteers, or at least probably paid quite a modest stipend. And so they were there because of their particular expertise and seniority and knowledge in a particular sector, and were in effect giving their time and expertise voluntarily. So, I was just always really conscious of the fact that I had to make it as easy as possible for them to do their job, and so that I and other members of the organisation could benefit from that expertise. And, there's nothing worse than being a board member who's kind of left out in the cold and doesn't really know what's going on. So I always felt it was my job to enable them to do their job as best they could, so that the organisation I was working for could get the most out of it.
And what does that involve practically? I mean, I often think about, how do I get the most out of my advisory board as a CEO? And sometimes it can be difficult because you're trying to balance the sort of the demands of their time, trying to work out where they're going to get highest return on that time invested. And they obviously have lots of other things going on. So it's not always easy to know when is a good time to involve them, when is not. How do you think about that? How do you draw that line? What have been the most effective ways that you've engaged your board or seen boards engaged?
So I think there's it's different for different organizations and different circumstances, but there's definitely a role for a kind of constant drip of kind of key information, whatever the relevant key information is. I think there's a place for news that they might be interested in, and it might be good for them to know as background and context, and also just to engage them in what's going on with the company. And then there's something about the kind of whole no surprises thing. So, a couple of times, when I've read the board papers for a meeting that I'm chairing, I'm finding things out myself for the first time, and that doesn't good at all. Yeah, so I think it's partly instinct.
What's the cadence that you interact with your CEOs now as a chair? Is it fairly uniform, or does that vary by board?
Yeah, it varies. It varies by board, very different circumstances, but regular. So typically I would have a conversation, a one-to-one conversation, not necessarily in person, at least once a month, and probably more like once a fortnight. And then quite often it's more frequent than that because something has bubbled up that needs more interaction.
So who sets the agenda for those meetings? Is that you? Is it the CEO? Is it a joint effort?
I think it should be the CEO. Certainly when I was a chief exec at UCAS, when I had my regular meetings with my chair, I would always have an agenda, and I would probably have pinged him a message beforehand saying these are the 3 or 4 things I want to talk about. But that doesn't always happen, particularly if you've got a slightly inexperienced chief exec who doesn't understand the relationship with a non-exec chair.
Brilliant. And where that relationship has worked best, what have been the hallmarks?
Oh, gosh. Well, that chair-chief exec relationship is just absolutely critical. So, I think it takes time to get there. It's not going to happen overnight in an instant. But when you get it right, I think there's absolute trust between the two people and no surprises. I think the chair's role is to back and support the chief exec, and unless a moment comes when you can't do that anymore. But I was reflecting with the awful news of Her Majesty the Queen's death. In a way, she was like a sort of non-executive chair, wasn't she, of UK PLC? And there's been quite a lot of interesting coverage from former prime ministers about their audiences with the Queen. And yeah, I just thought there were some similarities there about, the ability to have a private conversation between the chair and the chief executive, where you can absolutely trust that you can use your chair as a sounding board and hopefully get the benefit of their advice and counsel on whatever it is that's going on, and know that that's not going to come back and bite you in the bum later.
How do you do that? How do you build that trust? Because I speak to a lot of CEOs who will be very guarded with what they talk to their chair about, because ultimately they know, or they feel, that if they share their deepest worries, insecurities, incompetences, that ultimately it's their boss they're speaking with and they're going to lose their job. So how do you as a chair go about bridging that tension?
I mean, that's just such a good question. And that, that does require the build-up of trust over time. And, I think a chair is there to help chief executives when things are blowing off course or not going according to plan. And, it takes a couple of times of a chair supporting a chief exec through a tough period for that kind of trust to build up. But ultimately, it is the chair's role to make that work. That said, if your chief exec is always going to be guarded and not really be straight with the chair, then that's not an effective governance relationship in my view.
Yeah, really interesting sort of tension there. I suppose thinking about it from a slightly different perspective, what are the situations that you face that have been most challenging as a board member? Is there one that stands out, and how did you tackle it? I often encounter people who go, well, what value does a board really add? They're just a pain in the backside, and they come and make sure you've dotted your I's, crossed your T's, and tell you where you got your numbers wrong, which is completely contrary to the way I think about a board. And I see a board as should be the highest return on time invested that I spend in any given period. But can you maybe share some of the what's been one of the most challenging situations you faced as a board member and how you tackle it?
Well, first of all, I completely agree with you that, the ideal relationship is that the board meetings are very high value to the executive team. That's exactly what they're there for. And if the board isn't able to do that, then there's something wrong. It might be on either side. Thinking about a couple of really tough board situations, I can think of one where there was a sort of a changing of the guard in very controversial circumstances, and it was a large board and it went to a vote. I think that was, the most difficult couple of days that I had deciding on which way I was going to vote. And in the meeting, it was very high stakes and very high tension. Ultimately, I think that the board made the right decision. Another difficult one I had was actually when I decided to step down from a board that I really wanted to serve on and felt was really worthwhile, but I just felt that the governance wasn't good enough for the task at hand, and kind of managing that in a respectful but intentional way. Yeah, that was quite challenging. There's that kind of decision to make: is do I walk away from something or do I stay inside the tent and try to fix it? But I think I got to a stage where I felt I'd tried to do that for long enough and decided it was better to step away.
Okay, two really interesting challenges that I guess lots of board members will relate to. If we start with that first one around a complex issue as voting, how did you navigate that, the frameworks of thinking that you were using to get through that?
Yeah, it was really interesting at the time. I mean, there were a lot of side conversations going on. So actually, ironically, it served to bring the board together in a way that had never happened before, and I think forged some really strong relationships amongst non-exec board members, because that had just not really happened, or perhaps hadn't needed to happen before, but I think went on to create a stronger board for the future. So there were a lot of conversations going on amongst us non-execs, including one-to-ones with the chair of the organisation. And in the end, you make your decision. Whatever framework you use, writing a list of pros and cons or gut instinct. For me personally, that decision was really hard, because normally I'm a pretty good decision maker and I know quite quickly which way I think I want to go, and then look for evidence to support what I think's the right decision. In this case, I was right on the edge, so I did find that very difficult.
I've encountered that situation a couple of times as a board member. One of the things I found quite difficult to navigate was, especially when you're having those discussions with other non-execs, to what extent are you undermining the chair, and how do you have those conversations with other non-execs if you happen to not be aligned to the chair without undermining them? Yeah,
I think that's something that you have to bear in mind, and hopefully you have to be prepared to be open with your chair without breaking any confidences. But a confident chair is not, should welcome non-execs talking to each other and interacting outside of meetings. So yeah, it's not something that I personally would have any problem with. I would feel good if my non-execs were having interesting conversations about the board without me. Yeah. And I hope that wouldn't be plotting behind my back, obviously. And in this case, it definitely wasn't anything like that.
Good. Okay. And you talked a little bit about pros and cons. There's a great book, a lady called Annie Duke, called Thinking in Bets, where she talks about sort of weighted pros and cons lists as being, so that you don't just simply weigh all things up equally. And I'm always really interested in how board members think about decision making. What else sort of goes through your thinking when you're trying to weigh up a difficult decision like that, where I guess there's probably not a right answer, or at least that there could be many right answers, or maybe there could be many wrong answers? What are you doing to wrestle with that complexity?
Well, look, I think the first thing to say is that, things have already gone quite badly wrong if you're ending up having a vote on a decision at the board. That should be a very unusual thing to happen. In most cases, you manage a decision through discussion. And in most cases, I encourage the chief exec to be making a recommended decision to the board and presenting the evidence as to why that's the right decision to make. And if you come to as a chief exec, if you come to your board with a decision like that and you haven't got your ducks in a row, then it's probably your own fault if the board doesn't support the decision that you're recommending. So there's a management of all of that, and a chair should be able to step a chief exec through what needs to be done to get board members on board with something which might be tricky or controversial. So the going to a vote thing is, it's only happened to me less than a handful of times in my whole career.
Super interesting. Actually, funny enough, I was talking to a CEO the other day, a relatively inexperienced CEO, who had been through exactly that journey, where she said when she first started with her board, she used to present them all the options and quickly realized that that was just a disaster. The camel is a horse designed by committee type thinking. And has since now she cleared the board out and put in a new board, and now goes to them very much with, this is what I recommend, and then uses them to challenge, which seems to be the best way of operating with a board.
Yeah. So that's what a chief exec is paid to do, is to bring what they think is the right thing to do to the board.
Okay. The idea you talked about there as being challenging was navigating, sort of stepping down from a board in a respectful way, but at the same time still, by the sounds of it, leaving your marker that actually you disagree with the way that it's run. Can you talk more about that? Because that's a really challenging situation.
Yeah, it was a challenging situation. And obviously, it's not a bombshell that I would kind of drop in the moment. I think the signals that I might have be going that were there for anyone to see if they had been looking. And in the event, I let the chair know before the meeting and then stepped away. And I did then have a very frank kind of exit interview with the chair and the chief executive, where I felt I was able to express exactly why I had stepped aside.
It's a tricky one with how do you, I always wrestle with that as not abandoning an organisation, because normally you've got involved with an organisation because you feel passionately about it.
Yeah.
And so feel the responsibility. When you have stepped away, was it because you just felt actually there was nothing you could do here to change the situation?
If I was really honest, so I felt I had worked really hard on this board to bring whatever expertise I had to the governance and obviously to the issues of the day. And then, a couple more things happened and a couple more things happened. And I got to the stage where when there was a meeting and I got the board pack, I just was spitting teeth every time. Not least because some of the things that I felt were important in improving the information in front of the board had not happened. And I just thought, hang on a minute, here I am giving my time voluntarily and I'm hating this. So in this case, there was a bit of kind of personal, like, I don't have to do this if I'm not enjoying it. That said, I was still very reluctant to kind of step away from something where I felt I had a lot to offer, but you can only try so hard. And if you're beating your head against a brick wall, you just maybe just stop and let other people get on with it.
Super interesting. Now, as part of the research for this call, I spoke with a couple of people who sort of sit on boards with you, who shared with me a sort of number of insights. And one of them is that you are brilliant as a chair of bringing out the best in the individual board members. And I'd be really interested to understand, how do you think about doing that? What is your sort of secret sauce there?
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm incredibly flattered and delighted to hear that, because that's, undoubtedly a very important role. I mean, you form a board with the voices and the expertise and the knowledge that you think will be helpful to have around the table. How do I don't know. I really don't know what the answer to that is. I'm delighted to hear that that's a view that's held. I mean, it's fairly obvious when there are things being discussed that certain people around the table are likely to have a good input. And also, I feel that we might want to talk a bit more later about, the change in technology and hybrid meetings and so on. But there's something about making sure that voices that might be less ready to always speak up and say their bit, to make sure that those voices are heard and that they feel that they're given a little open door to walk through rather than having to kind of kick it open themselves, especially if they're less experienced members. So I hope that I do that. And also, my between board communications with board members is another really important aspect.
That was certainly one of the themes that emerged, is that you obviously spend huge amounts of time pairing and priming people without having a staged board discussion. And also, you're very good at bringing in people even where you might be the expert, or you in your own right are an expert on a topic. You actually bring in other people who might have different views. So curious to understand how you think about allocating time to this sort of preparation, and how do you get that balance right between priming people, letting them know that you are going to be expecting them to share a view, but without ending up with that situation that some boards do have where it's a staged rubber stamping affair.
I could probably think of a couple of situations where it might be right to have done that, but mostly not. I think my feeling is whatever the quality of the paper is for an item that's difficult or controversial or nuanced in some way, however good the paper is, it can never kind of convey what's really at the heart of the issue. So for something like that, that's the kind of thing that I probably would talk to other board members about beforehand, to make sure that they were on the right page about what the issue really is. And if necessary, there might be some kind of background which is important, but not the right sort of thing to write in a board paper. Yeah, so I think it's just a balance to strike about, really giving board members the opportunity to think about things before they come into the meeting, so that they're not kind of caught on the fly expecting to have intelligent opinions about something that they haven't been able to think about or understand before the meeting itself. So it's a kind of no surprises type approach, actually, Oliver.
How much time do you spend practically before any given board? Are you speaking with every single board member consistently before the meeting, or do you speak selectively with them?
Yeah, it slightly depends. I actually learned this from my chair at the Student Loans Company, Peter Launer, who's a very experienced operator, and I've got a lot of time for him. And when he took over as chair of the SLC, he, every single meeting, he has 15 to 30-minute conversation one-to-one with each of the non-exec board members. And I just thought, actually, that's just such an easy thing to do. And it's so important for me as a non-exec on the Student Loans Company, which, is a arm's length government body. So, a lot of the decisions are in any case dictated by government, or at least government funding. And, having that opportunity to get a little bit of background insight from the chair and express any views or find out a bit more about something that you're not sure about, I just thought was invaluable and made me feel valued as well. And so, so I try to do that with boards that I chair. It doesn't always work. People might not have time, or there might not be anything particularly to discuss that either I don't think there's anything necessary or they don't. But I think making sure that there's that space for one-to-one contact outside of the board is absolutely critical.
I suppose sometimes, I certainly work with chairs where they've done a version of that, but they've been on transmit. So you get this call from them and they basically spend the next hour telling you what they've been doing, and you sort of feel like at the end, well, okay, I'll give you a round of applause. That's great, but why did you waste, my time telling me all this? What value are you getting out of it? How do you think about striking that balance between, sharing information versus, soliciting input? Because to me, it always struck me, well, it would make much more sense if they just sort of shared a paper that we could all read first, and then we can just have a discussion rather than spending an hour, having the same conversation with, how many different people.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think my approach would be to probably highlight the thing, or the paper or the issue that's perhaps the one that's of most relevance for a pre-board chat, and just invite questions and comments from them. It is very much a receive, not a transmit for the chair, that kind of conversation. There might be some briefing that the chair wants to get over, but as you say, you don't want it all too stage managed.
Yeah. One of the things that came up in one of the discussions of the preparation, which I loved, was how you move people through differences of opinion. So one of the people I spoke with said, they had this particular issue. I think it was around this question of whether or not there should be a student representative on the board, where they vehemently disagreed with you at the start of the sort of discussion on this. And what was amazing talking to them was how good they felt about this disagreement with you, that they felt fully heard, but that you had brought them on a journey and taken them, by the end of it, realizing that it was absolutely right. And as they looked back on it with hindsight, you were absolutely right. And somehow you'd affected a transition in their thinking. And here was a very bright, independently thoughtful individual. How do you think about handling situations like that? You're obviously very good at it.
I'd love to be able to say that I had a plan about how to bring board members round to that particular decision, but I didn't. I think I was quite clear that it was the right decision to make. I can't remember how many discussions we had about, but we went round the houses a few times on this, and it's getting people comfortable. And I think in the end, it was the safety net of knowing that if it didn't work, we could reverse the decision, and also having an agreement about reserved business so that the board could still have discussions, without the extra board member present. It wasn't a carefully constructed campaign to get the right decision.
Interestingly, one of the things that stood out for them was that it was a very principled decision, that you were starting from a set of clear principles, that this was the right thing to do, to have relevant stakeholder voices in the room, and that everything flowed from there. So it may just be that that's your way of operating in general, that you've got certain key principles, and then that flows authentically.
I'm all for radical transparency, and that's sometimes not shared with other people.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see how uncomfortable people can sometimes get with that radical transparency. We share all of our sort of financials and reporting across the entire team. And it's amazing how much it empowers people and makes them feel valued and trusted. And as a result, they behave really well with it.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to talk also with you about learning and development in the board, given your sort of sector expertise, but crossing over with that functional expertise. It always strikes me that, I always hear, well, there are two parts to it. One is within the board itself. One of the interesting things that I've observed through this role as CEO of Nurole is how many boards think they know, or board members, to be fair, think they know everything and stop investing in their personal development. Interesting, there's often a divide along the genders. The female board members are much better at constantly learning, constantly questioning. Tends to be the male board members, although the really good ones are also good at constantly questioning and learning as well. But so there's that piece within, how do you think about learning and development within the board itself? And then how do you think about learning and development within the organization that you as a board are responsible for? Because so many organizations say, people are our most important asset. And then actually, if you actually push them on, what are you doing to ensure that learning is happening? How are you tracking it, measuring it, seeing the impact of it? People suddenly become slightly woolly. So I'd be really interested to hear how you think about those two aspects as an educationalist and board member.
I'm sure I'm not the first board member that you've spoken to who dreads that email that you get saying, please complete, the corporate online health and safety or GDPR or whatever, and then hounds you until you've spent, 2 hours of gobsmackingly awful online learning that really wasn't designed for non-executive board members. So I would come from a place of horses for courses. Again, if you're dealing with voluntary or boards that people they're doing because they're really interested in it, smothering them with compliance courses that weren't designed for governance level, I think is a really, really bad idea. Because I work on some boards that are in one way or another regulated businesses, I think understanding the regulatory framework, for in my case, the Office for Students or Ofsted, those kind of organizations, or Ofqual, the qualifications regulator, I think understanding where the regulators come from and understanding what the board's role is, what it's accountable for in the regulator's eyes is really important. And that would be something that I think is absolutely critical kind of development and knowledge transfer, if you like, for non-exec board members. And then I think also getting external speakers on key topics can be a really good way of doing it. You don't want to patronize your board members by putting them through stuff that they already know. But, on development days, I think having interesting topics, having some interesting speakers, having a good discussion can be amongst the most effective kind of development activities that you can do as a board.
So how often would you do a development day as a board in your sort of best in class situation?
Yeah, typically once a year. I think it's, depending on what your board cycles are, it's pretty difficult to do it more often than that. Although I like the sort of slightly overused concept of the deep dive. I think it's quite nice to have board agendas where, there's obviously some business that you have to transact at most board meetings, and then having at least one kind of topic which is conversational and strategic and you could say developmental, I think is a nice balance to have.
Got it. I mean, it's interesting that, isn't it? Because if an education organisation said to you, we're going to teach people once a year and that's it and done, you'd be horrified. Why is that okay in the board environment to have a sort of one development day once a year?
Yeah, I think it's adequate for the role that non-executives play. They're not doing a 9-to-5 job 5 days a week running the organisation. That is not their role. Their role is to have sufficient understanding of the context and the business and what's going on in order to give kind of strategic guidance and advice, and obviously check on compliance and regulations if that's appropriate as well. I don't see that that's in any way similar to how you might approach learning and development for an executive team.
Got it. And do you think, I suppose you talked about sort of knowledge transfer, there's also about the way that a board learns to operate with each other. What does the makeup of that learning day look like? Do you also work on, how do you operate better as a team? Or is it exclusively focused on the knowledge side?
Yeah, good question. I can think of circumstances where doing kind of team development stuff would be important, particularly perhaps for a relatively novice board, with new members who perhaps don't have a lot of board experience. I can see circumstances where that kind of development would be necessary. For more experienced boards where you've probably selected your board members and recruited your board members based on experience and knowledge that's highly relevant to the board that you're involved with, yeah, I don't think it's entirely necessary to be doing training. I find that quite a bit patronizing, actually. Okay. And so striking the right balance of making sure that relevant topics have got the breathing space for board members to engage properly with, and if necessary, have expert input from outside speakers, I think is kind of more the territory that I would be in mostly.
Got it. Would you ever do a retrospective on how you made a decision, looking back at if you had a big decision that you'd done and then sort of looking back at it as a board to analyse how you worked together?
Yeah, as I said, that happens so rarely that you have a sort of staged, managed decision to make. I'm very pro kind of lessons learned exercises, both for successful big decisions and obviously ones that go wrong as well. Yeah, it's not an executive. It's not, you don't, in the board, you don't need to, and I don't think you should need to deploy the kind of things that you would use in executive leadership in quite the same way.
Okay, interesting. You talked a little bit about the different sort of personas, I suppose, you put in a board. How do you think about building your boards as a chair? Are there particular archetypes you have as the cornerstones, or is it very much tailored to each organisation?
Yeah, I think tailored to each organisation. So the normal thing of skills audit and so on, well, what expertise would we want to have around the table? And, have we got gaps? And so, that's pretty straightforward to do. And then obviously, if you're recruiting board members, you're looking for people with experience to fill those gaps. That's normally how it works. I'm not much in favor of some of the approaches to diversity, which make you feel that you must have someone who's not white around the table is probably the most obvious one. And obviously the male-female one, to be honest, it's just never been a problem for any or many of the boards that I've been on, except perhaps back in the 1980s when I started out. Yeah, for me, it's getting diversity of perspective. Now, quite often getting diversity of perspective might involve getting diversity of ethnicity. That might be one of the tools that helps you get diversity of perspective. Kind of a bit more interested in diversity of background as well, because I think actually very often it's kind of socioeconomic background that gives you a really different outlook on the world rather than necessarily what colour your skin is or indeed what gender you are. And having said all of that, I also really worry about, the loss of talent from white males of a certain age who've got, fantastic expertise and experience to bring, particularly to voluntary boards and charities and so on, who are just being kind of screened out because they're white and male. And that to me is discrimination that's just as unpleasant as all the kind of more normal forms of discrimination.
Yeah, we certainly sort of see it, and there's a sort of growing resentment around it as well, which is not a sort of positive thing for, I think, society at large.
I agree.
Okay, really interesting. So I came across a model someone used recently where they talked about having what they described as a CEO whisperer as one of their archetypes. So someone who had been a CEO and who could relate to that experience as CEO, and then had other archetypes around deep functional or sector expertise, and then another archetype around stakeholder expertise. So in the case of a company that might be, listing, someone who'd been through that listing experience, or in the case of, a regulated entity, someone who knew how to navigate the government or the regulator, whatever else it might be. Does that resonate for you at all in that sort of diversity of perspectives? And where do you draw the line equally? You don't want a board which is all sort of CEO whisperers. It can equally end up being a nightmare.
I like that idea, though. Yeah, so I think the skills bit, you might want to have someone with public sector experience or government affairs experience. You might need people with sectoral experience or marketing or digital. Very often digital is a big gap on boards. So I think that functional stuff is really important. And then you layer the diversity on top of that. I think just hiring for diversity without trying to get the right skills that you need to transact the business is probably not the best way to go about it.
Yeah, there seems to be a sort of divide between those who go for, I suppose, the classic kind of McKinsey T-shape with individuals with spikes in a given area versus those who want these all-rounders. And I guess, one of the advantages of having those with spikes is you've got that deep expertise. One of the risks of it is that you get people who switch off in those moments when they're not the expert. And I've definitely been guilty of that, sitting in a board role where, a given topic came up and I just thought, well, there's the expert over there. I'm not going to add anything. And then actually further down the line, you suddenly realize, flip, I missed that because I had just deferred to their knowledge and I didn't ask the stupid question that actually was the right question. Where do you sit on that balance between, spikes and all-rounders?
I like both, actually. And I think, it depends on the particular board and the particular organization, what the right mix of that is. But definitely, if I think about myself, having chief exec experience in my executive career, I think it sometimes has made me a bit gobby on boards because I've got an opinion about absolutely everything. And sometimes I think, Mary, why don't you just shut up and let other people talk? So, it's all about getting the right balance, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's one of my big sins, talking too much. You touched a little bit on the regulated nature of the sector that you're in. And I think for others in regulated sectors, that's often a sort of big challenge. How do you see the sort of the political policy role of a board chair, given that it does play such a big role in the organizations you're involved with?
Yeah, I think if it's not something that the board personally brings to the group, then somebody else on the board probably does need to, because I think compliance from a governance point of view is not something that the board should take for granted. Then, there needs to be some expertise on the board to kick the tires of compliance reports, whatever form they take. There's too much to lose in a regulated business if you get it wrong. So it feels to me like it's an absolute essential in a regulated area to have that kind of expertise.
Okay. You obviously have a massive portfolio of roles. The people I've spoken with who work with you just can't understand, if you're doing what you do for them on every board, how you manage to do it with the time. They say it's just extraordinary, the level of attention you've given them. How do you manage that balance? And particularly as a chair, where there's always the risk that things kick off and it becomes a quasi full-time role for positive or negative reasons. How have you thought about that?
Oh, I think it's wonderful. I mean, I'm on 7 boards at the moment, and some of them are more or less, chairing. The 2 that I chair are obviously the most demanding. People who think it's, I'm saying, I'm not in an executive role. I don't have to manage people. I don't have to do procurement policies and, look over, office move plans and all that kind of, I'm not in an executive role. Basically, I'm just a kind of a brain for hire or a set of experience for hire. And it doesn't take that much time. I don't have to write papers and deliver board reports and stuff. I just have to do my thing as a board member. So I think it comes from a place where people just can't imagine actually what you do. The downside of it is a bit like feeling you're always on, because, however much you plan, okay, this board has got so many meetings a year and you know roughly how much time that takes. When something happens, basically you kick in. And so if there is a crisis or an urgent issue of some kind, you just do it. So having said all that, I think in my executive career, I think I always had a very high work capacity and work rate. And I don't know how you do that, but I, touch wood, somehow managed to do that. I could get a lot done in, very efficiently. And that served me quite well in my non-exec role. Also, don't forget that when I was 16 and left school, I trained as a secretary. So I'm pretty good on the admin side. I can run my own diary pretty well, although I do miss my beloved PA, who we regularly have lunch and churn over the good old days at UCAS and so on. So yeah, it's not falling off a log, but it's also not that hard, to be honest. Also, by the way, I have a dog. I don't know if you can actually see him in the background.
Yes.
He joined the podcast a little while back, and I walk him morning and evening without fail, quite long walks. And I do a lot of my thinking on those walks. That's my kind of thinking time. I have some weeks when things aren't too busy, some weeks where I'm working late into the night every night. And I get towards the end of the month, you can get little sort of banana bunches of board meetings, and that's pretty hectic. But yeah, it's not that hard, really.
And so what advice would you give to someone who's making that transition from an executive role into a plural career?
So for me, the most important thing of all is understanding the executive, non-executive line, which is a red line as far as I'm concerned. I think people who haven't got board experience sometimes don't get that quite right and think their job is to tell the executive what to do. And I just don't see it like that at all. I think, so I left UCAS, 5.5 years ago. I think it probably took me 3, maybe even 4 years before my kind of portfolio settled into its current pattern, where I'm, really happy with the stuff that I do and the diversity of things that I do. Along the way, I kissed a few frogs and, things didn't work out, or I decided I didn't want to do them. And yeah, so it took a while. And yeah, you need a bit of patience to build up a meaningful portfolio. And also, actually, the only thing that really worries me about all this is, as I get older and smellier and perhaps don't want to work full time, I'm working full time at the moment. I don't want to work full time. I'm not sure I'll be so efficient. I'm at my most efficient when I'm busy. So I'm not quite sure. For me, the transition to doing less will be harder, I think.
Fantastic. And you touched on that red line. For someone who's not familiar with that, how do you articulate that for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, the chief executive and their executive leadership team have a job to do, and they're accountable for that. As soon as the non-executives start intervening in a way which means that they might be marking their own homework, then something's gone wrong. If the chief executive says, well, that's what the board told me to do, I did it, it's kind of your fault, that's not going to work. So yeah, it's around whether you're overseeing the proper functioning of the executive leadership or whether you're doing the job for them. And doing the job for them is only something you do if in extremis, when something's gone really wrong and you need to step in. If that's happened, it's pretty bad.
And can you think of examples where boards where you've been sitting on, have got that wrong? Can you bring that to life a little bit?
Yeah, one board that I was on, there was a wonderfully enthusiastic and actually very knowledgeable non-exec, who wanted to go in and help the execs to, dream up projects and programs and stuff, which came from, very well-meaning. But it was clear to me what he should have been doing is offering expertise and guidance, but not actually going in and doing the work.
Yeah.
People come at things, usually from a very good place, but it's, for me, that kind of understanding about executive and non-executive responsibilities is quite crucial to proper functioning governance.
Absolutely. How are you different now as a board member to how you were when you first started?
Oh, blimey. Well, if I go back to my very first kind of non-exec roles 25 years ago or something, I hate to think what I was like. I'm sure I wasn't very good at it, and I like to think I've got better at it. And also, it's experience does count for a lot. It's very unusual for me to bump into a situation that I've never bumped into something that's quite like it before these days. Obviously that's not 100% true, but I think the more experience you bring to it, and also just observing good and bad board practice, keeps you on the straight and narrow, and hopefully always learning and improving yourself. But yeah, I'm sure I don't get everything right all the time, that's for sure.
Can you think of any particular things now that you used to do that sort of make your toes curl or you've learned not to do?
Oh, I think probably just kind of curbing my gobbiness is probably the main thing, especially when you're in the chair. Yeah, I think resisting the urge to know the answer to everything, something I have to work on.
Brilliant. Well, Mary, this has been absolutely fascinating. It's time to go on to the 5-question quickfire, where I say a short statement and ask you for a short response, if that's all right.
Yep, do my best.
First up is the best book every board member should read, and why?
Rebel Ideas by Matthew Syed, if you want to understand what good diversity should look like. And then New Power by Hymans and Timms, which I think is the best primer that people of a certain age, which you're often talking about people slightly older joining non-exec boards. It's the kind of best primer for how the modern information and technology age works, what it means to lead in a connected, social, networked world.
Amazing. I've not come across that one.
Yes, a must read. It's literally a page turner. I absolutely love it.
Brilliant. Your favourite quote and why?
Well, actually, I have a file in my drawer called Thoughts and Ideas to Hold On To, which I've been scribbling on for many, many years. And I think one of my favorites is a Saint-Exupéry one, which goes something like, a good relationship is not two people looking at each other in the eye, but two people looking in the same direction.
Love it. It sounds like that should be turned into a book at some point, a collection of things.
Yeah, I probably got the quote wrong, but it's something like that.
Brilliant. Your best ever holiday and why?
Yeah, quite recent, probably, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago. I did a big road trip in Morocco, and I love Morocco. Just got everything there, deserts, chalet villages, where they have a lot of snow and skiing and stuff in Morocco. Did you know that? Obviously the souks, Roman remains. Who knew that the Romans were that far south into Africa? And just the nicest, most charming people in the world. Add to that Middle Eastern food, I'm happy.
Winning formula. Fantastic. Your most significant professional insight?
Yeah, that's quite a tough one. And I think probably, and unfortunately, I can't remember when I first bumped into the concept of servant leader. But when I first heard that, I just thought, okay, that's it. That's what I want to try and be.
Love it. Well, I can imagine that, and that certainly shines through from speaking with all the board members I did. And last but not least, your favourite app?
I have to say Twitter. I live on my own, I work on my own a lot, and Twitter is my community, my chats, all sorts of friends I've made on Twitter in my kind of professional community. And I absolutely love it as a way to keep up to date with the sector I work in, education, and also I like to think also keeping my voice current in the sector as well.
Brilliant. Well, I shall be adding you to my list of people to follow. And Mary, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been an absolute pleasure listening to you and speaking with you. Really, really appreciate it.
Great. I've really, really enjoyed talking to you as well, Oliver. And by the way, I love Nurole.
Thank you.